my father was Greek and German. So I've always had an understanding that there is a diversity of people out there in different backgrounds. And actually, growing up in a very Italian, Polish neighborhood, I always was aware that how one defines oneself is part of one's self-internalization of self. As a kid, I wanted to be an artist, and my parents, when I said I want to do this for college, they said, oh, no, 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 no. So they had accepted, baffled by it, but said, sure, you can be an architect. And they accepted that as an alternate to being what they really wanted me to be, which was to be a doctor. I studied at Chicago's IIT, which was founded by Mies van der Rohe, who was very much Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus had a strong craft and combination with fine art as its background. And I really responded to that. The education program at IIT had a strong emphasis on craft work, and that you would have to know materials before you could design anything. So brickwork, you had to know how a brick worked before you could design any kind of archwork or any kind of design that was involving more than patterns and such. So structures, anything else was really based on the idea of God is in the details, and it really taught me a sharp focus on how things work and how things should be put together. As an architect in Chicago, I was able to explore those concepts and ideas, and very much it was about design and mastering materials and showing how even small areas and small details could be combined to create a whole component of that space. In the late 80s and early 90s, a firm in Australia had been borrowing liberally from my wife's architectural thesis, and she was recruited to go to Australia, and I thought, great, I'll be in the sun, the sand, playing with koalas, dancing with kangaroos, and just on the beach every day. But that wasn't actually the case. A number of projects in Australia that I worked on were featuring design that was a lot more experimental than I was used to in Chicago. And they were very open to focus on using glass as one of my expressive components for the spaces. And I used it very conservatively at first, saying that these are interesting ways that I could use glass within spaces. But since they do have a strong glass background in Australia, I was able to do more and more with it. In Chicago, I had done some architecture, but it was always very staid and almost just stained glass. In Australia, where the spaces were a little bit more open to anything goes in a lot of these places, as long as it could fit within the budget, I was able to start saying that glass was a nice component that would be both visible through and define areas with it. One of the projects that I had the most exploration in was for a British consulate in Brisbane, Australia. And I wanted to use the seal of Great Britain as part of it. And I wanted it in cast glass, reverse painted. I wanted to be able to see through areas and not see through areas, all in one piece of glass. That the fabricators said you can't really do all that in one piece of glass, and invited me to come to their studio to see how glass was really formed, so I had better knowledge of what I could expect glass to do. And after that, I was entranced by glass. I wanted to use glass in every project because now I knew some things about it. My wife, after 9/11, had said if she's going to work for a government, she wants it to be the U.S. government. So we moved back to the United States and focused on going to Washington, D.C. And I said, if I move back to Washington, D.C., I want to change my career. I want to get out of architecture and focus on being a glass artist, which she said, if you think you can do that, sure. So as I moved back to the United States, I was able to change from being the architect into being the artist. I offered myself up at the Washington Glass School to be their shop monkey, and that meant I would do every dirty chore. I would be setting up for every studio class. I would be the assistant to every workshop that they had. And by doing that, I was really able to have access to the equipment, and I was able to really focus my 7 days a week on working with that medium and seeing how that medium worked. And I was happily making bowls and doing other decorative elements, but because it really gave me a background as to how glass works and how you can fire with that glass. And I also had enhanced my education by going to some of the other studios around. I went to Haystack Mountain in Maine. I went to Penland. I went to Urban Glass in New York. And also I just started working more at the Washington Glass School. I became one of the instructors there. And then in 2005, I became one of the co-directors. My earliest forms of glass were an attempt to get away from architecture as much as I could. And so I worked a lot in kiln cast glass, and I liked the solidness of the glass. I liked the fact that I could shape the glass into forms that could be expressive, but had a different feel to it than what I was used to doing in architecture. And I also liked the idea of doing mixed media. So I used found objects. I used recycled glass because one of the directors of the glass school was very much into environmental issues and recycling, so I just started borrowing that imagery. I would sometimes find images in magic lantern slides, which were these big glass slides that were made at the turn of the last century. And I loved the idea that I could get images in glass, but I was kind of limited because they were only so big, and I was relying on someone else's imagery. So it became a thing of how can I get my images into glass? How can I make my stories and my scale that I want to work in? These images are some of the first, actually my first two pieces that I've ever done in Sgraffito. So that was from a workshop that I did in New York with Jeremy Lepisto. When I talk about Sgraffito, I'm talking about using frit powder to make drawings with. And so I'm going to be working on a light box. I'm going to be sifting crushed glass onto a surface of a flat sheet of glass and moving around with X-Acto blades or clay shapers, the rubber tip pointer, and I can get a lot of detail in it. And then once I have an image, I can fire it in, and I can let the image start saying, how does that whole panel evolve? How can I take it from that point to the next one by working layer by layer? My work started taking on a much more narrative direction with it. And when I'm saying that, I like to tell stories within my images. It's not necessarily a linear story or something that's representational, but it's something that I'm trying to create a connection with the viewer, so I'm telling a story where the viewer is the other half of the story. I'm only telling part of it, and I'm counting on whoever sees it to finish that story, because my take on it might be different than your take on it. And I started getting a little bit more architectural in the construction of the glass. I started seeing how things can be boxes, how things can be themes that are explored by using that medium of glass. I wanted to exploit that dimensional quality that glass has, that you're seeing through it, that you're seeing around it, that it's actually a sturdy enough material that can support itself and become a new shape and a new volume within it. And I also like my artwork to start having a sense of identity, and it could be drawn on my sense of personal identity or cultural background. And I wanted the works to be open enough that weren't specific to me, that they'd be open for interpretation. And I like the idea that I'm playing with light and shadow, and also sometimes going on to the ambiguities of what some of the objects are. I wanted you not to know what the whole story was, but I wanted you to imagine what that story could be. Some of my works, I began also to expand on the scale of them and also what series would mean. And I did a whole series based on tarot card imagery, where I was going to take traditional imagery and make it much more contemporary as to what it could mean today. The piece that's called The Tower there actually had won New Glass Reviews. The Corning Museum of Glasses in New York had selected it as one of their selections for the New Glass Review. And though I had done that piece specifically in setting it in Chicago buildings and making the jump much more exuberant because I didn't want any connection to 9/11, the curator, Tina Oldnow of Museum of Glass there, had wrote about how this piece is all about 9/11. And I thought, well, if the museum curator at Corning is talking about it, it is now all about 9/11. In my work, faster than I thought. This is how I want to work in my studio. I want to be essentially just illuminating text. I want to be quietly working on my work. This is my dream. But what I really have in my studio is much more chaotic. This is a studio that's a very busy studio in Washington, D.C. We have a lot of classes going through. We have a lot of people. It's a benefit to, in the sense that you really can be connected with a lot of people and a lot of activity and a lot of opportunities. But it's also a thing where I have to really think about how am I going to work my schedule and the schedule that are part of the studio. And I also am not working alone. I have some people who are there all the time. I have people like Tim Tate, who's a fixture in Washington, D.C. arts history, and Erwin Timmers, who's the king of recycling in the Washington, D.C. area. And though I'm joking about them in one sense, they really have been a strong influence in my work. Tim really has pushed people to explore narrative, and really his goal is to elevate glass to be much more conceptual and be much more something that you can say, bring it more as a sculptural medium. And that's had been a tremendous influence on how I approach the glass. And Erwin's work in recycling, where he's taking the content and the material and the colors and saying that they all can have underlying themes by the use of that medium, has also been an influence on my work. When I work on my pieces, I'm also working layer by layer, that I work separately and then I assemble together and fire into a slab. And so as I do that, each layer advises what the next layer should be, and I work backwards and forwards, seeing how those colors and how patterns would work before I fire it up. One of the pieces that I'm going to take you through is a whole panel from start to finish, in terms of concept to finished panel. So I'm also going to start with some rough sketches as to what will be the overall pattern of the piece. And then I'll start working on individual sections, usually starting on what I think will be the central image, so I can go backwards and forwards in relation to scale and appropriateness into the imagery. And then after that's all done, I'll be sequencing it up in the kiln to say what's on the very bottom, so it's the farthest back, and what's towards the front, so that would be closer and sharper in detail. And it's a matter of layering it up in the kiln, and I have done times where as I layered it up, I'd have to stop the whole process and take it apart because the pieces just all assembled don't work together. And this is the final piece after it was fired. I'm often asked who is the subject of my pieces, who's posing for these pieces, and who is that? And I've used my wife in my early works as my go-to model. She could pose, she could be happily taking her clothes off and saying, here's this, and I was good. I said I would disguise who you are so workers don't say, oh, that's your wife naked, that's your wife naked. I just started saying there's ways I could disguise it so you're not quite sure whose body is that. And it did work for a good part of the time, but when I started doing male nudes, then someone said, so there's things about Kay we didn't quite know. I also began a strong relationship with the galleries that I worked with, and Warren Littleton had been very key towards that relationship on how works can be seen within a different context than where I'm working in my studio. That often when you start arranging works, they have to start having dialogues created with other works, how other people see them, and it gave me a lot of advice on how I'm presenting my work and how things are going to be seen by people outside of the myopic glass world, which is only focused on glass. Sometimes with my imagery, I'm also reaching that age where I'm having family members die and leave boxes of photographs. And it's a thing that I felt bad about, that I'm seeing these beautiful images that are almost haunting in their quality, and I began using them as a personal source of imagery for my work as well. So I would say I have no idea who some of these people are because they're unnamed photographs. I have no idea why these people are sitting on donkeys in the middle of the thing, or why we have that, who these people are, but they create a strong sense of storytelling that I feel compelled to use as well. Sometimes the images, when I'm using them, will be a direct translation from one thing to another, where I just want that image, it's a strong image. Sometimes they tell me a story that I feel like I should tell with I had gotten the Fulbright, and that took me to the UK, and it was a wonderful opportunity. Tim Tate had also gotten a Fulbright, and we were able to maneuver this into being 2 Fulbrights at the same time, which they had never done before. And it was a great experience because we were there with a lot of the UK artists, some well-known artists like Jeffrey Sarmiento, who also works with technology and silk screening of frit powders. So we had a great time there, and we were able to really connect with the artists there. And actually, we're continuing on some of that connection. There is a university from Wales that has been asking Tim and I to do master classes in Wales. But when I was in the UK, I was really taken with their history of print imagery. And since I'm doing something that touches on concepts of prints and how you layer images and how you pull them apart, I wanted to do something that reflected that. And William Morris, not the Billy Morris of glass, but William Morris of prints from the 1860s had done a lot with printmaking that I wanted to talk about time in my pieces as well, to start including how passages of time could be. So I started using his print patterns as a background to some of my work. And then I wanted a very contemporary face on the surface of it, and then talk about passage of time by constellation charts to go superimpose across them to create a sense of timelessness between 2 different eras. And I did kind of like that whole concept. I felt that it was really working because I was also looking to branch out and start including more color in my work. I always have a very controlled color palette, but I'm starting to say I can start introducing color. Another artist I worked with said, color is a slippery slide. You're going to go down that slope and you're just going to keep on saying more and more color. And in fact, she has gone down that slope, and she said, I can't stop now. I like the idea of color. It's given a sense of work that I still respond to a controlled palette, but I do feel open to including more and more color within my work. Some of my works have also been exploration of perception, of what you see and how you see things and how you interpret those things. So I began exploring different ways to say, how can I affect the way that you as a viewer are seeing this? How can I start maneuvering it to different avenues that you would normally see? And I had done a whole series that was based on anamorphic projections, where you're looking at a distorted image that when you look through another device, the perspective is corrected or the image is brought right. And I really like this kind of series, and I actually worked with the presenter from this morning, the introducer, Chris Shea, had made some of the steel work for that because I wanted a very precise circle pattern that I was not able to achieve in the welding shop. And that's why these pieces also have eyes on them. I wanted them to really be about how you see things and how you perceive things. The way that I had made these was that you would have these distorted images, and when you look in the cylinder sides, you would see them corrected. But I'm so happy with that distortion that that was what I wanted to go for. And I began to do distorted images in my work and saying, I'm not going to fix them. They're just going to be exactly like that. And I like that sense of surreal quality that comes through those works. And I began saying, I like that new world that I'm creating with that you're really having a greater clarity about your world that you live in if you distort everything in the artwork. And it lets me create a whole new world where I'm in control of what that reality is. And it also gave me a chance to use some of the cowboy imagery from my family that I thought we should start using these stories. In response to some of people who now they perceive my work only on looking at the website and they'll see JPEGs. And I had a gallery in Washington, D.C. say, so you're not even working in glass anymore. That she only sees a flat image, and that my work might be considered getting a little bit formatted into a regular format. I started saying I need to really start expressing the glass quality to my works. So recently I've been doing a lot more lost wax castings and integrating one different glass type with another glass type to create something that really breaks through the boundaries and starts taking me out of the box type of thing, where I'm going to be actually getting rid of the framework to my pieces and actually saying that I have no easily seen way that I'm mounting it on the wall, letting the glass really read as glass pieces and letting me elements, again, of architecture start giving me a new context to my pieces. In one of the more recent series I've been doing, I was inspired by Erasmus Darwin, who's Charles Darwin's grandfather, and he wrote about, it was shocking at the time for the 1870s to be saying there's a relationship between plants, sexuality, and people. And it later influenced his grandson, Charles Darwin, but he gave it a sense of new world and evolution, which I thought that fits my themes. So I had done a series of pieces where I wanted to have beautiful people and then combining them with cast glass to start obscuring their beauty and saying that there's an element from one world that actually stops you from perceiving the next world. And this one is some of the stuff that's on right now at the Habitat show. But I was doing it with lost wax process, and we had to do a lot of lost wax process to do that. And that's where you're going to be making the clay form, putting rubber around it and making the wax form. This is our studio coordinator when she realized that I said I need 100 forms for each. But she worked gamely on in the studio, chugging away at making daily a number of molds, and you'd have to make the wax, pour plaster around it, melt out the wax, and then you're going to be firing those pieces in the kilns to make it individual objects. So I spent almost as much time making the components as I did making the original panels that I'd be mounting them on top of. And it's a labor-intensive process, but to me, to make these stories, I wanted it to be a very rich pattern. I wanted it to be a certain lushness to the elements on top. And then I started layering it up after I did color studies as to what those pieces would be. And then combine them to fit that whole concept of what nature is and what sexuality is in these pieces. And I did them with floral themes, but I played fast and loose with what the colors are because I just wanted to have a strong emphasis of color within my work. And I also really wanted to play on how that sense of perception. I really wanted these to be sculpture panels that were projecting out, that were where I normally work flat, now I'm actually working much more three-dimensional. Some of my early works had actually resulted in me getting architectural commissions or larger scale commissions. And one of the pieces I had done a few years ago was about 12 inches high. I had the Palomar Hotel in Washington saying, can you make this 6 feet high and 3 feet deep, and we'll pay you a small amount for the same amount as the original piece. And I said, I can do it, but it'll have to change the budget, and we'll also have to incorporate some other elements. And again, I worked with Chris Shea in making the steel work, and then we were able to make a piece that's in the hotel lobby now. And I was lucky enough to have the locals issue of The Onion give a review of the artwork, calling the piece the prettiest fucking which is an honor. In the glass studio, I thought I'd just point out who my studio mates are. You have myself, Sean Hennessy, Erwin Timmers, Tim Tate, Audrey Wilson, and we work on a number of architectural projects in the studio. And one of their more notable projects was the Library of Congress doors. We had remade the bronze doors that were done in the 1930s and remade them in glass. It's a long-term project. We've been dealing with them ever since 2004 on different concepts on how it could be. But those 11-foot-high bronze doors no longer met code. They weren't working properly. They were starting to just be a dangerous thing for them, that they were compelled to make those changes. So it was a leap of faith by the architect of the Capitol to say we're going to translate the whole imagery into glass. And doing that, it let me get back to being an architect. So I could play the architect hat, and I was doing all sorts of design concepts, bringing through what the different methods would be on how to translate those ideas, all the shop drawings, all the design work, and dealing with the different levels of hierarchy you have to deal with when you're dealing with the architect of the Capitol and the Library of Congress. But it also gave us the opportunity to involve a number of other people in that process. We had gotten some youngsters, and Sean Hennessy was leading the charge on taking molds of the original building. And so we had people from the prop department of the Shakespeare department, Shakespeare Theater. We were also able to, in fact, include some artists from the early studio glassing was Ray Algren in his studio in Portland, Oregon, was going to do some of the final firings because they had better skills and techniques as to getting a lot of that detail that was required from these panels. We also had done these molds during the hottest part of the year, and I remember Sean was baking in the sun there. But as we worked on the molds we actually were able to get special order glass from Bullseye just to get on the clarity of that piece. Sometimes as you work in these lost wax forms, the glass will flop right out easily, and sometimes you'll have to end up chiseling away at the glass and hoping that you're not going to damage it as you go hacking away. But the detail we got from the glass was incredible, and it's a beauty. These pieces also had a separate article written up by American Craft about the work that was done in that. And if you're ever able to go by that Library of Congress Adams building, you should take a look at these doors, especially at night when they act as a lantern and the light comes from the inside to outside. And they were scrutinized. These panels were heavily scrutinized by the architect of the Capitol representatives. They wanted to know exactly what was going in there. And we started worrying that if they start rejecting everything because they were not to their standards, we'd be out of business because the federal government only pays after the whole project's installed and approved. And we brought in one of the art critics, William Warmus, to just give an overview of what his take was on the glass to calm them that they were getting, in fact, state-of-the-art glass work. And after he spoke to them, they felt a lot more calm about what they were getting. When we installed it, it was actually a very nice thing to have the workers all vie for having their pictures taken with the glass panels. And it was a really nice thing to say that there's a directness in the average guy that's installing it wants to be part of that project. And it was an honor to be part of something that's the Library of Congress, which is known throughout the world, and it's an important institution in the United States. This is actually a side-by-side comparison of one of the bronze panels and how it sits next to the glass panel. And I'm going to say that that's going to be how I'm going to end up the talk about my work. And I might say if we can turn up the house lights and see if there's any questions. You know that Tim's going to be throwing things at me. Are there any questions? Questions? I was asked about when I'm making the images and I'm referencing layering, what I mean by that. I actually work on thin layers of glass. They're about 1/8 of an inch thick. They're sheets of flat glass that I buy from a supplier of glass, and I'll work on individual levels one at a time. So a panel that's back there might be 5 layers thick. I will work on one layer. I will even use sometimes even clear just to exaggerate the sense of depth to it. And then as I'm done with those layers of glass, I will go into the kiln, have it set up for a large panel, and I will layer them in sequence from the back to the front inside that kiln. And then I fire to temperatures around 1450 degrees, and that melts it all into a solid slab. And then I just need to cold work the edges to clean up any edges that have filed separately or flowed out into ways that I didn't want it to go. Yes,
I was just wondering, in that process, do you need some sort of fixative on the frit so that it doesn't move as you're putting a new layer on it?
Do I use fixatives when I'm doing the frit powder? No, I don't, because I actually like the looseness. I want to be able to push around the powders. And there's a little trick that if you were at a workshop, you would see that I was saying that sometimes to erase or take away some of the frit powders, I'll actually use a synthetic brush, rub it against my pant leg, and there's a static electricity, and I'll hold it over the piece, and it's like a little vacuum that pulls up a little bit of the frit powder. And that's how I'm able to add and subtract until I get the right level of density. Now that means, of course, I've got a glass sheet that has loose powder on it. So as I walk to the kiln, I got to make sure there's no fan going on, that there's no chair in the way, because if I just go clunk, the whole thing will shift not in an attractive way. And then as I place it in the kiln, I can close the door and turn on the kiln and pray to the kiln gods. There have been times, I'm going to point out, that I got it into the kiln, but it was not safe, because then a fly came flying in and landed right in the middle and then spun around into the piece, and I didn't know what to do other than I closed the door and I turned on the kiln, and I said it's now got enhanced by, it's a collaborative piece. Yes?
Regarding the Adams Building doors, where did the idea come from to use glass? It seems so felicitous. And also in view of the Art Deco detail in that building, some of which is absolutely exquisite. Who thought of doing it? That's
I'm the curator for the architect. The reason is because it's about safety and egress. And the old doors didn't have a way of opening if somebody was in the building. They didn't clean people at night. So they wanted a new set of doors, but the old ones are still there, the original
Oh,
architect.
no, I worked in the building.
Yeah, they're still there. So the idea was to have something then they let the light through, but they're the modern whatever doors that will open if there's an emergency or fire or something in the building.
That's true. That is how the doors came into play to being changed out, the requirement to change that. But actually one of the people who are very high up in the architect capital, I believe that he's like #2 man of the architect of the Capitol, had done some workshops at the Glass School years before, I think before I even was there, that they had done a lot of outreach activities to get people who are at risk, or different organizations were coming in to do dry plaster casting. So open face casting was something that he was familiar with, and he actually had a sample from that sitting on his desk. So he would look at that every day and saying that glass could be the way to make a leap forward and say we're translating and making a whole reinterpretation of those doors. So it's not just one for one, and now we've got new bronze doors that match it. And I think that it was a big leap of faith to see that and to see how that quality of glass would change that scope of that building entry. That now it's much more light-filled through the inside of that lobby, and at night the light comes outside, and now it's part of the surrounding nature, surrounding the whole walkway of that street. Yes?
Well, as far as your work is concerned, and also that project, you can see, or I think I see, how serendipity, if you pay attention to it, can feed into your career. Like this man took a class years ago and never forgot that. This is something you wouldn't expect, you don't expect that,
The glass is magical. Glass does that.
And for you, you're coming back around to architecture after a long
Yeah.
and bringing everything together into a wholeness in your life. I think it's great.
Thank you. I think that is a thing that once someone had said, oh yeah, but for you just open your hand and the ball falls right in. I'm saying, yes, but I spent years to get to that point to do that. Things don't just happen. I'm not able to be able to turn and say, well, here's a redesign of the doors to allow for this to be this size pattern, and this, unless I had that knowledge. And that discipline that I had from those years before does inform my work currently as to how I approach it, how I think about mounting techniques and everything else to it. It is serendipity, and it is a thing where I can't not excuse that there is an element of luck and fate and chance in everything that happens. So, knock on veneer. Yes?
Yes, like make preliminary remarks. I've only taken a glass fusion class. So, but going forward, as revisiting your architectural forms, and you're getting that 3D effect.
Mhm.
How did you keep the glass from bleeding? And you had nice geometric lines, and it looked wonderful. How did you get that so that it didn't
Just blob all over.
Exactly.
Well, I'm doing a technique for those house forms. It's called dry plaster casting, and that's using a deep bed of sifted plaster that's been cooked in the kiln. And I'm going to be pressing in an object into it, and it's going to define those zones that the glass can flow through. And if the glass does flow out of it, then I will grind it, polish it, and clean it up. But ideally, it's going to stay exactly where I said it was going to go. And it is a bit of juggling around. I have seen times when or other people have fired where they put on so much glass that it starts flowing over the edge of the whole kiln shelf. That much glass has been put on, and I'd say, okay, you got to start really thinking about how much is going to flow. So some of it comes from trial and error and just learning where the glass is going to go. Yes?
Artists generally have a tendency to be against mass production.
Yes.
But have you developed any techniques that could be applied to creating images that could be sold in stores as mass production pieces, but that are unique to your style and technique?
So have I thought about how I can make mine a little bit more of a commercial or design project rather than an art project, so I'm able to sell it through a store or online department type thing?
Could you go Martha Stewart if you were?
Well, I certainly would probably limit it to certain run elements if I was to say I want to be very commercial about something, so I could have a separate identity and say, this is what I'm thinking when I'm doing this. And certainly I'm happy to entertain those notions, because I see nothing wrong. Coming from the Bauhaus, I'm always going to say, Bauhaus training, I'm going to say that you think in terms of mass production, and you think about how to streamline things, and you think about how you can work faster, smarter, better. And if I can, I'm not a purist, I will do whatever shortcut I can to get things faster, because I want to produce artwork, and my work I found is so labor intensive that I can only produce a certain number of pieces each year. And even when I try and say I'm going to do a piece that is going to be simple and straightforward and just almost the atmospheric piece, I labor and labor and labor on it because I can't quite get it to feel right. If it's out of my comfort zone, I will work on it even more and more than a regular piece. Yes?
So as a follow-up on that, say for instance, someone like Keith Haring, who was able to translate his fine art skills into t-shirts and books and mass production and large-scale pieces.
Yes.
What's the limitation as far as taking some of your intellectual property and mass marketing that, and then also taking building large outdoor pieces that can be seen in parks or in front of buildings, etc.?
Well, if your question is what's going to stop me from mass production, or do I see any limitations to that, and to work larger scale so it can be more visible. The larger scale ones, I'm usually saying it's a matter of the fabrication of it. It's a lot of work to figure out how you're doing that. The Washington Glass Studio is doing a very large public art project for DC right now, 16 feet tall in front of one of their new healthcare centers in Ward 7. And that's a lot of time and effort goes just into logistics, the engineering of that, dealing with how that's going to be done in a time and budget manner, that actually pulls me away from my artwork. So I'm happy to do that if I'm able to figure out how to, first of all, get those contacts where a client's saying, yes, I want a 16-foot high imagery piece here. I'm happy to talk with them about that. There's an artist named Richard Jolly who's just done a huge installation in the Kentucky Knoxville Museum. And that was $1.1 million to make that. I'm open for any in terms of working in t-shirts and so. If there's someone who wanted to have my stuff on a t-shirt, I'm happy to talk about that. Usually though, if I have sold a piece, I'd want to make a new piece that was directly for that purpose, rather than to say it was something within my artwork piece that someone else has not become part of their collection. But if they're open for that, and there's someone who wants to put my stuff on a t-shirt or mint box, I'm happy to get on top. Yes?
First, I want to thank you for your answers to this woman before about, how you come about to this point.
Yeah.
It's hard work, period. I think that's what it boils down to. Most people are not given that social school. It doesn't sound like you or you, but anyway, I appreciate hearing that. I have a couple of different questions.
Yeah.
When I hear the word film, I often think of like a pottery film, but you're not talking about that kind of film. You're talking about film and a fire, right?
No, I'm talking about electric box kiln.
Oh, the regular,
Regular-
like a pottery?
It's like that. The glass ones usually have the elements on top, and the ceramic ones on the side. And the ceramic ones go much hotter usually than the glass ones, but it's the same form.
Okay, so if we're looking at the piece like I see on the screen here,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's one piece of glass that's infused maybe
Yes.
2 or 3 layers?
Yes.
And so first you put the glass in by itself without any design whatever on it?
Well,
Or you may have etched into it using
Yes.
different tools?
I might have done something, yeah. And I can talk about this one in particular.
Well, this is easy, because it's there.
Well, I'll use this one because it's as a description of how I work on a straightforward, simple fuse piece, because it's right on the screen. And this one has a number of face components on it, and I actually had cut out circles of colored glass, and then I had taken those glass pieces, which are just cold, and there's a sharp edge to that circle that I cut out, and I'll use the frit powder and draw an element onto that. So if it's an eye or a nose or a mouth or whatever I was doing on there, that's what I would do with the frit powder. And so I would take those circles and put them in the kiln, and I'd fire them at a temperature that was just enough to melt the frit powder onto that sheet of glass. Because I like to use black powder, it melts in at a lower temperature than some of the lighter colors. So at 1200 degrees, that's Fahrenheit, it had melted onto that surface, and I could pick it up and say, what am I going to do with this?
You usually work on it after you pull it out.
I could do work with it. I could add more to it. I could add another image to it. I could work it on the backside, because it's usually a clear piece of glass. You could have a lot of fun, and I do actually enjoy it very much. It is an enjoyable process because you're creating it, and to me, in a sense, the artwork is actually the process of making the piece. The after piece is the result of it, and it's a reminder of what it was, but making the piece is so central to what I want to do with it, that actually that's, to me, when they say you had fun, it's actually the fun making the piece. It could be a challenge.
Right.
I'm not there sitting there laughing saying, ha-ha, but it is a thing where I'm enjoying that process of doing it.
Do you ever find, I do some pottery and whatnot, and I'll get so involved in what I'm doing, and I'm constantly being told, you have to write down what you do. Write down the color, write down this, write down that. And I don't do it because that's how I do it. But then when I look at it, and I'm really crazy about it, I can't remember what I'm going to.
You should always keep good records of it, and I certainly do tell people to write that down so I can say, because they're going to do another
If you want
piece.
to repeat it.
Well, yes, they will say exactly that. They will say, I want a piece just like I did last time, and I will look at them blankly and say, I have no idea what you've done. So tell me in detail, and it might be myself, it might be one of our studio coordinators. Someone else is going to have to work with you in our studio. Someone else is going to set the kilns and turn on the program for that, so they need more information.
Do you think the self-discipline comes from architecture? Because you really need a lot of that.
It could be my background and my own personal heritage that I've learned that if I did not control my activities, I would do nothing, that I would just be essentially frittering away time, and that it was not until I was in college and later in college that I decided that if I don't buckle down, I will be doing nothing, because I was easily distracted by everything interested me, and I found that I'm not getting anything accomplished. So that's where I said if I focus on it, I will get the things I want done. 1, 2, 3. It's not that easy.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes.
Do you ever have to worry about air bubbles between the layers?
Yes. You're talking about air bubbles between layers. That is a thing. Usually the glass has some ripple or texture to that sheet of glass, and I'm stacking up layers of it. And if I'm working like with an eye and essentially making a circle of black that will fire immediately down to the next layer above it because it'll heat up right away, and that will trap an air pocket. So it always became an issue of how can I make it so I minimize the air bubbles. Now, in one sense, I don't mind air bubbles in glass in general, because I'm going to say that shows that it's handmade glass rather than factory-made glass. And I also have people who constantly think that I'm doing a photo image onto a blank of glass, and I'm going to say, no, 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 this is actually layered up images, so I don't mind there being a reference to the air bubbles. Besides the fact that my work can sometimes be a little bit tight, it gives me a looseness because that air is going to move around things. But to accommodate that, I've done a number of tricks, and it depends on what the piece is. If you put little chads in the corner, you can make it and run the schedule slow enough, the center of the glass will go down first and then squeeze the air out. Another one is just to go in a very slow schedule that naturally it's going to just be held at a long time, that it'll just start by its own weight pushing down before I get a big air bubble. Having said that, I've had disasters happen where an air bubble just goes right through the piece. And what I had to do, and sometimes it comes down to, can I salvage the piece? Can I make it whole again? And for one of the pieces that I don't think that Maureen Littleton ever knew, I drilled through a number of hole patterns to make this piece look like I always intended to have these holes. And since it was referencing moths, I put in text as the infill to those points. It looked like a moth that had been eaten through itself with text. I thought, there you go. And now it looks like it's a whole piece. Yes? titles and how I come up with the titles of the piece. The titles are actually are part of the piece that I really feel is important to it, and it helps me understand what I feel as though I'm saying with that piece before I expose it to the public or give it to the gallery or put it on a website. And I do think long and hard about each piece. It's usually after I make the piece. I don't have a title when I'm considering the piece. It'll be just a direction, or I want it to be kind of a moody piece, or I want it to be a much more serene piece, and that's how I'm going to work with it. And as it evolves, it'll take its own life on its own. And sometimes I want it to be a very verbose title, because I feel as though that's the one that really makes you drawn into the piece. Like a piece where it has butterfly wings on part of it, and a woman on a chair, standing on a chair saying, "How does one become a butterfly?" she asked, is the title of one piece. And other times it'll just be high noon, that's it. So it does come down to, after I look at the piece finally finished and know that there is no more I'm doing to that piece, then I want to say, well, how do I reference it? How do I give a clue or an insight as to how I want you as a viewer to take on that interpretation? Knowing that a lot of people will never look at the title. Yes?
So Michael, what are you thinking of doing next, tomorrow, next week? What direction would you like to move in? I'll ask.
Well, I want to go at 180 miles an hour, but I know that that will burn me out really fast. And actually, this has been a very busy season. There's been a number of shows and openings going on. I'm always guided by practicality in terms of, we have to get this done, we have to this. I'm part of a very busy studio that one of the things we do every week is assess where we are within studio projects, where we are within classroom projects, and where we are as artists in terms of who has a deadline that we must meet. So that is a thing that I'm always conscious of, besides the fact that my wife will be having her own issues or whatever things that come in that I have to take as part of it. And I don't want to be facetious about that. My wife is an important part of how I am being an artist. I could not afford to be an artist without having someone who supported me as directly as that. And the fact that she was an artist herself really allows me to work a lot looser. And she was a docent for the Women's Museum of Art in Washington, D.C. So in reference to the titles and stuff, sometimes she takes me into different places as to what the concepts of the artwork would be when you talk about the work. So she gives me different insights into my own work that I'm not aware of, and she will sometimes tell me that I'm wrong with what the piece means and correct me, which I really appreciate. But where I'm going to go with it next, well, I do like working in larger scale, but I also like going large and then small, because once I've worked large, then I like the intimacy of a smaller piece. And there is something about that size that I can say, I'm working on it, I'm focused on it, I can go into a smaller kiln, I don't have to use the biggest kiln possible, which I can't always get, but that lets me say I'm going to tell a story, tell a story, tell a story, and lets me go next, 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 next. So I often will think about what shows are coming up, and I know that the Lilton Gallery will be doing a big show in Chicago in November, so I want to make sure I have works that she's happy with to take there, because I do have a thing that, though she never tells me no on artwork, I know that she sometimes will say this piece would be better than the next piece. Although I like the idea that sometimes I can challenge her and have pieces that she was not that sure about do well in a show. And that means that I have never any idea on how people respond to a piece until it's out there.
So artistically, you're more of the same?
More of the same. I'm a more of the same kind of guy. But it is.
Curiosity.
It'll always be that something will come up that will throw me off in a loop, and then I'll usually ignore it and want to have nothing to do with it, and then it'll find that it's wormed its way into my consciousness, and I'll have to go back and just see what else I can do with it. And I wanted to get away from architecture for so long. I just wanted to have nothing to do with it. I wanted to have pieces that were not, in fact, physically pretty, which I had accomplished. And then I just wanted to say, these are pieces that are much more raw about my work. And then slowly I started letting myself relax on that concept, and I started saying, you know, I don't know why I'm running away from something that I should be drawing inspiration from, since I have that natural inclination. So I started letting it come back in, and it actually became some of my stronger works were the pieces where I just let things happen the way they were supposed to happen. Yes?
Is that the stuff that you call grit?
Yeah.
Is that similar to, I mean, it's the form of glass,
It's usually the glass that
ground up?
ground up with the different grains. You can get a really coarse ground glass, and they call it frit, and you can get really fine ones, and they'll just call it powdered frit.
The same glass that's used in enamel?
I do sometimes use enamel, so it's a little bit different. And when I work with float glass, the enamel would sometimes be a thing when float glass has a tin side, and that enamel would sometimes react to the tin side. So I'd have to be conscious of that because it sometimes wasn't quite compatible. But when I'm using ground glass that's made from the same chemicals as the base sheet material, I'm much more secure in knowing that there won't be a compatibility issue. Yes?
I noticed you don't wear anything over your face or coming in direct contact. You're concerned about the glass getting in your skin.
Oh, glass is dangerous, but you're seeing pictures where I'm saying, take a picture of me, and I'm not going to wear a mask. In fact, I'm not going to wear a mask right before where I end up with this big red circle around my mouth. We did have once a photo shoot from one of the local TV news agents had come in to let Tony try it, and he was going to do a Fox News report from the glass room, and he was going to do a little bit of sgraffito, and he just like oh, I don't think I'll do this anymore. He's done. Then I started getting letters from people saying, how come you're not wearing a mask? How come let Tony try it with a mask on? And I said, well, okay, for photo shoots, it's a little bit different. I am supposed to wear it, and I certainly do encourage everyone who works with glass, you're dealing with danger. And that is a thing you need to take into account. And otherwise, when someone comes in the studio and sees me not wearing a mask, I say, I've just been holding my breath for the last half hour. But it is dangerous. You are dealing with dangerous materials in a glass studio. Great. Yes?
I feel like there's probably a whole talk in the one slide that you showed of the transition from architect to artist.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more about both the how and the why.
Well, you're asking about how did I become from the architect to the artist in ways that I wanted to always be the artist. I had wanted to be the artist. My parents had been dead set that no son of theirs was going to be an artist because how much of a failure would they be to have that? And they were very much a product of their times, and I don't fault them at all for that. As an architect, I wanted design to be all. I wanted design to be the pretty things. I wanted it always to be what I could supplement my artistic inclination for. But design is the smallest part of any architectural project. It's usually budgets and schedules and drawings and coordination of different trades. And so that was not at all what I wanted to do. And working in Australia, where I felt like, well, here's a chance for 10 years I was there to refocus what my focus would be in architecture. Again, it started even getting more litigious where people were saying immediately that you better show exactly why you use one product or another. So I'm now writing reports as to why I chose a door hinge over a different door hinge. And that, again, was taking me away. And money-wise, where once architectures got 7% of the construction costs, we were losing projects at 1.5%. I'm saying, I don't know how I can do this faster and faster and cheaper, and still give them the quality that's wanted. So as an architect, I would do some design contests and design competitions. Early on, and before I moved to Australia, I had done work in wood. And actually, not until much later did I discover that Lloyd Herman, who was the curator of the runway, had been one of the judges of a wood competition that my wife and I had won first place in. So it's not until later that I said, there's a connection that I never knew I had, that only now that I'm back in Washington that I realized what was there. And I would do other design competitions for designing textiles and fabrics, and it was always a way to say, I still want to do artwork. And when I was, as an architect, doing things with cast glass, it gave me, again, that feeling of I'm designing a whole lobby of cast glass, and that gave me another way to say I'm connected to being an artist, and that's what I wanted to do. And so my wife had gotten out of architecture and went into business. And our agreement was, I supported you while you went back to get a new degree. How about you support me? And that's where she, again, I'm depending upon that to say, yes, I can do that, but we did that. And it's a challenge, and it did give me a new focus as to what I should be doing with my work, and it also made me sure that if I'm going to do it, I better do it full-heartedly. I can't do it timidly and say, I'm going to do a little bit of this and not be sure that it's the dedication I want to be putting into it. Okay, any other questions? Okay. last chairs from this weekend's workshop at front. Sure.